bloodiest attack in Egypt's modern history.
This is going to be a great concern for President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi.
El-Sisi said he will respond with brute force to combat the terrorists.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're tracking this week. Unrest in northern Sinai. It's a story the Sisi government wants told its way. Robert Mugabe's media legacy. He did not transform Zimbabwean news outlets. He made them his own. Governments not based in Washington are now using Donald Trump's criticism of the U.S. media against American journalists. And a match made in heaven, the mainstream media and royal weddings. We begin the program in northern Sinai, Egypt, and the coverage of the deadliest attack in the country's modern history. Between the bombing of a mosque there and the gunmen who followed, at least 305 people were killed. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has promised to avenge the dead through the use of what he calls brute force. And he has reiterated that he and only he can guarantee Egypt's security and stability. But with each passing attack in northern Sinai, that line is becoming harder to sell. A state of emergency has been in place there ever since 2014. Independent journalists have little to no access. But at least President Sisi can still count on most of the Egyptian media, especially talk show hosts on television, whose loyalty remains firmly in place. Looming over the news coverage is a critically important piece of legislation, an anti-terror law passed 2 years ago that restricts reporters from publishing anything that contradicts the government's account of these kinds of attacks. Our starting point this week is a dateline the Egyptian government has tried to turn into a black hole for news, northern Sinai.
If you have marketed yourself as the only person who can protect the security of Egyptians, then what you say after that security is breached will be taken by the news media and placed under a microscope. Given the scale of the attack in northern Sinai, President Sisi's uncompromising tone was not unexpected, but some of the words he chose were new and worthy of note.
President Sisi used the term brute force, which is normally associated in Arabic with evil, with injustice, rather than justice and upholding the law and preserving security. And he said it very intensely, as if the use of brute force over the past few years in Sinai has not contributed majorly to the worsening situation that we're seeing today.
The response was, we're going to take revenge, even to the level that the word vendetta was used in Arabic. And we're going to use this as an opportunity to rally support from all Egyptians in order to cement the military regime of Sisi. So it wasn't only about fighting terrorism, it's part of a propaganda war that is being waged by the regime to ensure that there is no opposition to it so long as it is fighting terrorism. And there is no accountability whatsoever.
The Egyptian media landscape has turned into a burial ground for critical journalism. The US-based Committee to Protect Journalists says at least 26 reporters are behind bars, making the country what it calls one of the biggest prisons for journalists. Of the 180 countries, the Paris-based Reporters Without Borders ranks in its annual Press Freedom Index, Egypt is 161st, below both Turkey and Russia, which is not easy. Unfettered journalism in print is rare. On the airwaves, it is virtually non-existent, an important factor in a country with a literacy rate of below 75%. Egyptian TV channels are littered with talk show hosts, many of whom owe their jobs to their loyalty to the Sisi government and their flair for the dramatic.
دي رصاصة من الرصاصات اللي كانت في الجامع. صعب تشتريها؟ مين اللي مموله؟
They blamed the MB, the Muslim Brotherhood, for the attack, as well as governments in Qatar and Turkey that they accuse of being sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood.
Ahmed Musa, for example, I mean, he just had a 4-minute spiel where he repeated over and over, time and time again.
أس الإرهاب وسبب الإرهاب ممول الإرهاب قطر وتركيا.
Terrorism is Qatar, Qatar is terrorism.
قطر وتركيا.
Turkey is terrorism, Turkey is Qatar, Qatar is Turkey, Turkey is terrorism.
لا من قطر ولا من تركيا.
The MB is terrorism. That is the only word that we should use. MB, Turkey, Qatar, terrorism, over and over and over again on loop.
أنت سبب هذا الإرهاب في مصر قطر وتركيا. مش حد تاني على فكرة.
It was really quite the thing to behold.
It's important to remember the role that television plays in a country where there's such a high rate of illiteracy. Okay, there are millions of Egyptians who are still illiterate. That's why you have somebody like Ahmed Musa of such import, because he's able to brainwash so many minds by virtue of oversimplifying the arguments.
سيد الرئيس امبارح قال لك القوة الغاشمة اللي هي عندك الاف 16 الرافال اضرب عندك الاباتشي استخدم كل القوة اللي عندك دمر احنا خلاص.
It's almost, as it were, a fast delivery service to the uneducated.
Where the authorities hold the upper hand on northern Sinai is access. They control it. Egyptian journalists are almost never allowed there, which the authorities insist is for their own safety. International journalists are locked out too, but Cairo cannot stop them from broadcasting the images or relaying the facts as they understand them. When that happens, the Foreign Ministry or the State Information Service assail those news outlets, and often the countries they are based in. And the talking heads on Egyptian TV turn those criticisms into talking points, as if parroting the authorities' intolerance of real journalism is a form of journalism.
فيها اتعلموا من البي بي سي، أصبحت البي بي سي وخاصة الخدمة العربية في البي بي سي حقيقي مقززة، والخدمة المقدمة من رويترز أصبحت حقيقي سخيفة.
All of them attacked the BBC. These leading TV personalities were undertaking, obviously on the behest of the military regime, to attack regional powers and to say that they were backing terrorism, to say that leading international channels were actually towing the line of the terrorists and supporting a terrorist attack, with no contrary view allowed at all on any of these channels.
البي بي سي قناة حقيرة، ما في جريمة إرهابية والبي بي سي تساند الإرهاب.
Foreign, independent, and for that matter, any intelligent, clear-eyed reporting on the Egyptian sphere right now is going to run into problem. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson, there's an aggression there, the kind that is born of an ability to look at the color white and call it black, and deem you insane for criticizing what may be fake news on the part of the administration themselves.
This is not the first time that we see the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the State Information Service attacking foreign media outlets for their coverage. The regime has to understand that you cannot black out a region in this time of technology that exists in every individual's pocket. And unfortunately, instead of the regime understanding this dynamic, it continues attacking foreign media outlets that are continuing to cover the story.
There has been quality journalism produced by Egyptians on the attack in northern Sinai under difficult, mysterious conditions. The Maha Azzam website produced a riveting story based on the accounts of survivors who painted a vivid picture of how the carnage unfolded. The site used to be based in Cairo, but now functions in exile, and access to it has been blocked in Egypt.
What Maha Azzam is offering is the space for survivors and victims of these attacks to have political opinions of their own, to be agentive actors in the political sphere that understand the causes and consequences of things and that can offer up their own solutions to these problems. But of course, Maha is banned in Egypt, and its outreach at the moment within Egypt is extremely diminished. And again, this is part of the state strategy of a monopoly on information and sources.
And also, they are taking the risks that are considered at times to be deadly. Sending a reporter to the field in Sinai is simply exposing yourself to risks of arrest and worse. And we have seen many examples of journalists that have been arrested in Egypt simply because of covering the Sinai or attempting to cover the Sinai.
And Maha Azzam's journalism is the exception that simply proves the rule in Egypt. The Fourth Estate there remains under siege. There are no signs of that lifting. The field has been left to channels either owned, controlled, or faithful to a government that treats real journalists like criminals, real journalism with contempt.
There is only going to be one source, and that is the military source that's going to be provided through these very popular TV personalities. It's a matter of propagating a particular narrative, a narrative that says that the regime is pursuing a successful fight against terrorism, despite the reality that we know that the escalation of violence has increased fourfold or maybe even fivefold since the military coup. And I doubt very much whether this kind of regime is going to allow for any access to independent journalism, whether in Sinai or anywhere else in Egypt for that matter.
We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Johanna Hoos. Johanna, Washington and Moscow seem to be into some kind of tit-for-tat media tussle, each government calling media outlets from the other country foreign agents. What does that even mean?
That's right, Richard. Now, you might remember that last month, the US government actually forced RT, which is a Kremlin-funded international broadcaster, to register its American arm as a foreign agent in order to continue broadcasting in the United States. Now, the accusations were that RT was functioning as a propaganda tool for the Russian government and that it spread fake news during the 2016 US presidential election. So last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a retaliatory bill, which is called the Foreign Agents Law.
Who stands to be affected by this? Is it just American media outlets? And what's it going to mean for those affected?
So the outlets that most likely will be affected by this new law are actually those that are receiving funding from outside of Russia. They will most likely include outlets such as CNN, German broadcaster Deutsche Welle, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Voice of America. And they will most likely be forced to actually disclose their funding sources and to label all the content that they produce as that being of a foreign agent. Now, if they fail to meet those requirements, the Kremlin might actually suspend these outlets.
Now, on the very same day that Vladimir Putin is signing that bill into law in the Kremlin, President Donald Trump in Washington is sending out a tweet in which he continues to criticize CNN, specifically saying CNN International is still a major source of fake news. And the timing of that tweet actually happened to come in quite handy for a distant government, the one in Libya, didn't it?
It did. So Donald Trump actually claimed that CNN is reflecting poorly on the United States and that it is spreading fake news to other nations. Now, he emphasized, and I quote, that the outside world does not actually see the truth from them. Over in Libya, they actually used that tweet to question the authenticity of a recent CNN report in which it was revealed that refugees were being sold as slaves inside the country.
You are watching an auction of human beings.
Now, on the website of a broadcaster called Libya 218, there was actually an article which was headlined, "Trump says that CNN lies." So what about the slavery report from Libya? Now, in that article, there was a suggestion that a lawsuit might actually be launched against CNN.
So what we're seeing here are international implications of something that's been happening domestically in the U.S. ever since Donald Trump was elected, his whole fake news offensive against the media he does not like. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks.
A little more than a week ago, Robert Mugabe, the only president most Zimbabweans had ever known, announced his resignation, reluctantly. He did not jump. He was pushed by the military, and the overthrow sent Zimbabwe's media scrambling. Mugabe had held them in his grip for nearly 4 decades. Robert Mugabe came into power 37 years ago as a revolutionary anti-colonial force. The media landscape he inherited was tightly controlled by his predecessor, Ian Smith. It reflected the interests of the white minority. A transformation was in order. However, Mugabe did not reverse Smith's media policies. He adopted many of them, ending hopes of a free press. Journalists covering certain stories faced harassment, imprisonment, even assault by the authorities. There may be a new man in the president's chair now, but what that means for Zimbabwe's media is unclear. After all, Emerson Mnangagwa was at Mugabe's side while all those journalists were being repressed. The Listening Post's Will Young now on Robert Mugabe's media legacy.
It was evident right from the start of last month's military coup in Zimbabwe that the generals were following Robert Mugabe's example, strong-arming the media. In his last media appearance, Mugabe gave a speech flanked by military commanders.
And material conditions.
When he appeared to deviate from the script, the generals were having none of it. They had learned about media control from one of the most autocratic rulers in Africa, and they used that against him. Even as a revolutionary, Robert Mugabe understood the power of the media. While in exile in neighbouring Mozambique in the 1970s, Mugabe broadcast speeches back into what was then called Rhodesia, calling for the end of white minority rule and positioning himself as a leader who could stand up to imperialism.
The enemy we are fighting is not just Ian Smith and his regime, it is Ian Smith, the British, the Americans, the French, the West Germans, and the Zionists.
After negotiating independence in 1979, Mugabe came home the next year to a hero's welcome. More than 200,000 Zimbabweans turned up to see a man whom they'd hardly seen for years, in person or in the media.
The Rhodesian government had banned even showing his photograph. So this mystical figure, then when he arrives here, it was a momentous occasion. I would say that the Rhodesians helped to build his mystique, and therefore profound significance as a new leader for Zimbabwe.
The only time when coverage of Mugabe or ZANU-PF was deemed to be acceptable was when it was negative. In the little coverage that was published, he was routinely referred to as a terrorist leader.
Despite constantly being branded a terrorist, Mugabe had the backing of the people. And come Zimbabwe's first democratic election in 1980, he became the country's first black prime minister. Given Mugabe's vilification in the Rhodesian media under Smith, he moved quickly to transform the Zimbabwean version.
One of the main aims of media policy after independence was, to use Mugabe's words, to decolonize broadcasting and print media institutions.
My fellow Zimbabweans,
and it was really important for them to fight media imperialism more broadly. So they decided to transform the national broadcaster and also to gain ownership over the Rhodesia printing and publishing company that owned the majority of newspaper titles during the Rhodesian era.
The main Zimbabwean newspaper publishing company was actually controlled from South Africa. Their news coverage was sympathetic to white interests. So his first agenda was to seek to wrest that control from foreign ownership.
The Nigerians helped us to buy the Zim papers from Argus Press, £5 million. The Nigerians were part of the liberation struggle. They trained many of our fighters. So this would have been a continuation of that trend. It appeared imperative then that the new government should have a media outlet.
apartheid was condemned as inhuman.
For the most part, Mugabe did not transform Zimbabwe's media, but instead adopted methods similar to his predecessors. The Rhodesian Broadcasting Corporation became the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, ZBC. The Rhodesian Herald became the Herald, Zimbabwe's most widely circulated newspaper. Both proved dependably loyal until last month's coup. But if there was one issue that would define Mugabe's approach to the media, it was land reform. In the 1990s, expropriating and redistributing white-owned farmland among black Zimbabweans helped Mugabe shore up his waning popularity. And as foreign journalists began to report on the story, Mugabe found a way to use the framing of it by the Western media, particularly the British media, to foster an us and them narrative that would serve him for years to come.
You are not wanted to be here anymore.
For the death of a white farmer over the weekend. The incident unfolded from about 6:30 local time here in Harare.
The global media representation of the Zimbabwe crisis in the early 2000s was often presented as a racial conflict between white farmers and a black government. And this was helpful to the Zimbabwean government in many ways because it allowed them to prove that Britain was mainly interested in Zimbabwe because of the white population.
So one would have expected a more balanced view of the land reform. as part of the decolonization process. But no, the media went wild, the British media in particular, and highlighted the atrocities against the whites, more than those against the black workers on those farms. So it became a spectacle to put in the front page of British newspapers or electronic media a white who has been battered or killed.
As I recall having a conversation with a news agency correspondent based in Harare, and he said, you know, if I supply a story to my editor with a headline, "White farmer killed by violent black squatter," I'm on the wire. I'm going to have my story featured in the international press. So certainly the way in which race played a part should not be underestimated.
That white families were being kicked off their farms, often at gunpoint and without compensation, was a big news story. But Mugabe turned the international media fixation on that story against them, claiming they had a pro-colonial bias. Whether that was true or not, Mugabe exploited it. He banned news outlets like the BBC, calling its journalists agents sent by Britain to destabilise Zimbabwe, knowing that anti-imperialist messaging would resonate with voters and reinforce his leadership.
Leave us alone. We are Zimbabweans, not Britons.
If the foreign press had adopted an even-handed approach, comprehensively looking at each and every aspect of that problem, in order to present a fair and balanced dissemination of news,
We don't want any photo here.
they would undermine the president of Zimbabwe by removing the carpet from under his feet.
Mugabe's relationship with the British media would become outwardly hostile.
What have the British to do with Zimbabwe? Who are you? You bloody idiots!
But, in a way, symbiotic. Mugabe gave journalists an easy story to cover, the cliché of an archetypal African dictator, and they in turn provided him with an easy target.
Journalists, tell those you are representing that the Robert Mugabe is still here, well and strong.
Allowing him to dust off his old anti-imperialist credentials to combat the international media, a tactic that would help the Zimbabwean leader survive for 37 years. Until now.
Finally, feel-good stories with a little royal sparkle push people's buttons all over the world. And when news, if that's what you want to call it, broke of the engagement of Britain's Prince Harry to American actress Meghan Markle, no one would have been happier than the woman at 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister Theresa May, because her struggling, Brexiting government can use the distraction, any distraction. Check out the blogosphere, though, and you'll find many a news junkie wondering if all that airtime that the media lavish on the rich and famous might not be better spent elsewhere. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.